Which era of the NBA was the most exciting, had the most parity, and shaped the game to be a global phenomenon? I'm going to do my best to subjectively answer these questions today. After recording the series 96 Versus, where I analyzed the 1996 Chicago Bulls against championship teams from the 2000s, it got me thinking about how great some matchups between different era teams could be. Yeah, I know, cheap plug. The links and playlists for that series will be in the description. So then, thinking of the talented players and teams throughout certain eras, I thought it would be interesting to take a look through some of the current eras and give my thoughts on the good and bad from each, and in the end, give my opinion on which decade was best. Now, I know the NBA spans way beyond the eras I'm going to talk about. Since how I've been around for 40, I'm going to do eras in the last 40 years. The 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. Today, we'll discuss the 80s and 90s, and I will drop the 2000s and 2010s shortly after. But before I hop into those legendary years, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us out and keeps the content flowing. So for now, let's take a trip to the 1980s. So some may be wondering how I'm going to score this. I'm going to try to keep it fairly simple. I'll look at the champions and their legacy in the association, the parity during those years, were the titles won by one conference, or was it back and forth affair? Then I'll take a look at the prime players of those years and their impact on the game. Of course, because of how this works, some players will overlap decades, so we'll take that into account, but we'll focus on either their championship years or their best/award-winning years. The 80s were quite the decade. Most will agree that this was the decade that catapulted the NBA into prominence as one of the major sports leagues in the US, mostly on the backs of two men and two teams. Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics, as well as, of course, Magic Johnson and the Showtime Los Angeles Lakers. Speaking of those Showtime Lakers, they were the definition of a dynasty, being a part of 8 of the 10 NBA Finals throughout the 80s, and bringing home 5 Larry O'Brien trophies during those trips. Larry's Celtics were not far behind, spending half the decade in the NBA Finals and bringing home 3 rings. The Moses Malone's Philadelphia Sixers and Isaiah Thomas' Detroit Pistons rounded out the other champions throughout that decade. You don't get more legendary than those teams. The Los Angeles Lakers having, who many believe, the greatest point guard ever in Irvin Magic Johnson, teamed with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the already legend of the league, who while his time was dwindling, was still able to be a major force on the court. Add in Tar Heel and all-star small forward James Worthy, and there you have one of the all-time greatest teams in the history of the league, led by Hall of Fame coach Pat Riley. On the other side of the field were those green and white wearing Boston Celtics, led by Hall of Famer Larry Bird and anchored by greats Dennis Johnson, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, among others. Finally, those much-hated bad boy Detroit Pistons with point guard great Isaiah Thomas, his bodyguards Bill Laimbeer and Rick Mahorn, and the sidekicks Joe Dumars and Vinnie Johnson. Please don't copy his shooting style. Those teams basically ruled the 80s, with Moses Malone's Sixers powering their way in at times. The parity was split for the most part, with the West taking home 5 and also being dominated by the Lakers and Boston, Detroit, and Philly on the East taking 3, 1, and 1 respectively. The 80s will probably be remembered by some as a boring era outside of those flashy Lakers and Celtics, as the NBA was still an inside-outside game of fundamentals back then. While you may see a 3-ball shot at times, it was nowhere near a staple of the game, and those that shot it were basically considered specialists, and that was one of their only jobs on the court. The days of the athletic build were starting to pour into the league, but as some like to call them, plumbers and construction worker body types were still running rampant on most NBA teams. And with teams loaded to the brim like the Lakers and Celtics, box scores looked like those of today surprisingly, with much slower bigs roaming the paint and more athletic or ball-moving teams being able to exploit those advantages. Also the fact that the league was only comprised of 23 teams at that time, so when a team got a solid combination of players, they usually stayed with that squad for a while, meaning that only the best of the best filled out rosters with less teams available. These were also the years where the NBA got its reputation for having tough defense, basically meaning you'd almost have to concuss another player for them to call anything beyond a regular foul during those days. And fist flying normally just meant a common technical, unlike today where a common touch foul can lead to ejection and multiple game suspension if the refs see it wrong. Oh yeah, and in 1984, with the 3rd pick in the draft, the Chicago Bulls drafted some guy named Michaeljordan. Yeah, the guy that went to Boston Garden in 86 and dropped 63 on the soon-to-be champion Boston Celtics. The guy that won the NBA MVP in his 4th season. Also the guy that won the NBA scoring title every year from 1987 to 1993. But we'll discuss him a little later. So let's grade the 80s era, and we'll grade each category out of 5 basketballs. Champions, 5 basketballs. Some of the greatest teams ever assembled in basketball. Parity, with the West and East splitting championships 5 and 5, I'll go 4.5 basketballs. Prime players, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Isaiah Thomas, Moses Malone, young Michael Jordan, young Charles Barkley, Dominique Wilkins. That's a who's who of greats. But I'll be somewhat bullish in this and say 4 basketballs. So 1980's average, 4.5 basketballs. The 90s, oh boy. The 90s aren't just memorable because of who I'm about to talk about. They can best be described as the years the NBA went global, becoming a worldwide spectacle. Those are the years I really got into basketball as a preteen and teenager, so my intrigue and love for watching the game was at its peak. The 90s era can pretty much be called the Michael Jordan era. Even though he was a major deal in the mid to late 80s, it was this decade where he and those Bulls put together the blueprint to dominate a decade. The Chicago Bulls, led by Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Coach Phil Jackson, basically owned the 90s, bringing home 6 of the 10 championships in those years. I even think they could have snatched 2 more, another cheap plug. But that's just headcanon, so let's move along. The last hurrah for Isaiah and the Pistons led to a chip in 1990, while the Houston Rockets with Hakeem Olajuwon firmly in his prime took home back-to-back rings in 94 and 95, and the Twin Towers of Tim Duncan and David Robinson won in 1999 with the San Antonio Spurs. If you watch my channel, you've heard me talk about those 90s Bulls many times, but if you haven't, they're easily one of the greatest dynasties in NBA history, and the 95-96 iteration, bringing in Dennis Rodman to round out a big three, is basically considered the greatest team of all time. Jordan through those years collected plenty more hardware, grabbing 4 more NBA MVPs, 6 Finals MVPs, and a host of All-NBA bids. Unfortunately, many of the legendary superstars of that time had to watch Jordan hoist trophies from the sidelines, unlike the back and forth of greats vying for the title in the 80s. Greats like Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, Clyde Drexler, Patrick Ewing, and Shawn Kemp fought tooth and nail to get a hold of the Larry O'Brien trophy, but like a Dikembe Mutombo finger wag, no. Looking at the 90s, you'll probably see some glaring differences from the 80s. While there are those that just see the players from the 80s and think low scoring, the 90s were really the era of plotting low scoring games. There could be many reasons why, but from memory and just the eye test, the evolution of the player continued, and in this era, the agile, athletic centers ruled much of the game unless your name was Michael Jeffrey Jordan. Guys like Prime Hakeem, David Robinson, young Shaquille O'Neal, Alonzo Mourning, even Patrick Ewing could step away from the deep paint and put a hand in your face. The 90s also could be considered the next expansion era, as the most expansion since the ABA merger came to be with teams like the Charlotte Hornets, Miami Heat, Minnesota Timberwolves, and Orlando Magic getting their start during the late 80s but had their major beginnings in the 90s. Some even argue the league was a bit diluted during these years due to expansion. Tough defense, the same tough defense I spoke about in the 80s, was at an even higher level. Hand checking and no defensive 3 seconds meant getting to the basket and making perimeter shots were even harder. The physicality was at an all-time high, with players literally being bigger, stronger, and faster during these days. The 3-ball was still a shot meant for specialists, but more and more perimeter players began to take it, although the NBA moved it further back in the late 90s. Also, the 90s is where the big man began to step out a little further away from the basket and attempt mid-range shots a lot more regularly. Hakeem, David Robinson, even Ewing would torch teams whose bigs were too slow and whose wings weren't big enough to stop them from shooting over them. So with more athletic players and less specific defensive rules, tons of fouls and slow burn games were the norm in that decade. Though interest was at its highest due to you-know-who, in fact, the 1998 NBA Finals is the highest rated finals ever, and the current eras haven't even been close to that. So let's grade the 90s. Champions, 4.5 basketballs. I have to be honest, besides the Bulls, the Rockets had a great team, but I wouldn't rank those Rocket teams in the pantheon of legendary teams. Underrated though, but not even close compared to those great teams in the 80s. Parity, 4 basketballs. You can analyze and research, but it comes down to the reality. The Eastern Conference took home 7 of the 10 championships through those years. As said, the new expansion teams blending into the conferences could have caused some lack of parity, as 4 new teams had to have talent stretch their way in the early 90s, and the Toronto Raptors and Vancouver Grizzlies, now in Memphis, came in the mid-90s, leaving some teams not being able to team stars with lots of talent. However, you still had some outstanding teams on both sides, with teams like the Knicks, Pacers, and later Heat and Magic making the East a dogfight, and out west the Rockets, Jazz, Sonic, Suns, Trailblazers all being exceptional. that just happened to be in the NBA while those Bulls teams were still together. Prime players, 5 basketballs. Prime Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, Hakeem Olajuwon, Scottie Pippen, Karl Malone, David Robinson, young, raw but still a superstar Shaquille O'Neal, Patrick Ewing, John Stockton, young Tim Duncan, Clyde Drexler. I can keep going, but I think you get the point. The 1990s average, 4.5 as well. I know there'll be some very pro 1990s people and some pro 80s, but I see them on par with each other for very different reasons. I feel the star power in the 90s surpasses those of the 80s, only because of how media began to spotlight players a lot more in the 90s than 80s. So if you weren't certain players, you had to watch the games to really see who was who on the court. The championship teams from both are some of the greatest squads of all time. So with the Bulls having maybe the greatest team, I had to rank the 90s fairly high. Then the parity, I could really drop the rating for the 90s, but because the Bulls were so dominant, didn't mean there weren't some tough teams in both conferences. And if you watch those playoffs, the years Michael was retired, it was anyone's ball game those years. But what do you all think? Which era did you enjoy more and feel the game was at its most exciting out of these two? I'm sure there'll be a stark difference from those older and those younger, but please let me know in the comment section. Also, if you want to ascend to GOAT status like number 23, please like and subscribe to the channel. Hope you all enjoyed. I'll be back soon with part 2. Thank you.